Good evening, friends. Today we have a last day for our Ind-AS webinar series. We received great feedback from all of you, all the participants, regarding the session organization and more particularly for the faculty and the structure of the presentation, the way and the PPTs. We will share yesterday's PPT and today's PPT both together after this session. Let me introduce for the new participant today's faculty, C.S. Shweta Milani Doshi. She is a Bachelor of Commerce from University of Pune, Chartered Accountant, Intermediate rank holder. She has completed Diploma in International Financial Reporting Standard by ACCA UK. She has also acquired certificate on Forensic Accounting and Fraud Detection from our ICAI. She has an articleship from GD Apte & Company, a very leading CA firm. She is a senior consultant at FinPro Consulting and specialist in Ind-AS for around 4 years. Presently, she is a partner at Doshi RC & Company, handling internal audit, valuation and Ind-AS division of the firm. She is a speaker at various forums, including big branches of our ICAI, corporate training, and many other places. She has a very big Ind-AS exposure of around 4 years, including IFRS, Ind-AS, US GAAP. With this brief introduction, would like to give session charge to C.S. Shweta Milani Doshi. We have our session till 6 p.m. today for next 2 hours. Thank you, Shweta.
Yeah, thank you, Virag. Thank you for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. I am Shweta Milani. From past 5 days, I have conducted various Ind-ASs. So on day 1, we had started with introduction and the asset-related standards. After that, we covered the government grants, related parties, and operating segments. And in the past 3 days, we covered the most important standards. Those were financial instruments, consolidation, revenue recognition, deferred taxes, business combinations. So this is how we try to cover the Ind-ASs in majority of the manner so that you have a grip over Ind-AS, and wherever you need any application, you have the knowledge of Ind-AS. That was the main motive of this webinars. I tried in my best to simplify the standards in the extent possible. Today's agenda for our seminar is the fair value measurement standard. After that, we'll cover the share-based payments. And after that, we'll cover certain Ind-ASs, only difference between the Ind-AS and Indian GAAP. So detailed coverage of those standards are not required because majority they are similar with the Indian GAAP. But I'll just focus on the differences so that on and whole you have a comfort over all the Ind-ASs and you know what is the difference between the Indian GAAP and the Ind-AS. So this is how we try to cover all majority of the Ind-ASs. And wherever you have any further requirement, we can discuss it thereafter. So, Ind-AS 113, that is fair value measurement. This standard is relevant for understanding Ind-AS, as well as there are certain people who are pursuing the valuation course. So, for the purpose of valuation course also by the IBBA organization, the registered valuation course, for that purpose also this standard is much relevant because one of the topic in that valuation course is Ind-AS 113 or IFRS 13, which is a fair value measurement. So let's begin with what the standard is, what kind of guidance it has provided, what are the valuation methods given under the standard, what are the disclosure requirements as per the standard. With respect to the valuation exam, you get MCQs with theoretical part of the standard. And that is why understanding each and every part of the standard is very much relevant because you have to fill in the blank with the appropriate theoretical word or with the appropriate definition of a particular aspect or whatever it is, or certain condition laid down under the standard. So that is why please try to understand the standard in much crisp manner. So let's begin with the introduction. So Ind-AS 113 or IFRS 13, here this is a standard which is a single source standard. So what does it mean? Other Ind-ASs, wherever they give reference to the fair value measurement, you have to come straight to Ind-AS 113. So what they have done is instead of dividing the entire guidance in various standards, they have laid down one particular standard for the fair value measurement. And wherever any standard uses the word fair value, you have to compute the fair value in accordance with Ind AS 113. So this is a consolidated guidance for the purpose of measurement of fair value. Now to just list down which all standards have governed or which all standards have given fair value requirements. The first and foremost standard, financial instruments. It requires you to measure the assets and liabilities at fair value. Second standard is, say you can say investment property. You require disclosure of the fair value of investment property. After that, you have to, if you need to use the revaluation model, in that cases you require to compute the fair value. There are various ways or various locations at which you have to measure the fair value. But how to measure this fair value is a question. So that is why this standard governs how to measure the fair value, which methods to use, and after that, what kind of disclosures are to be given
Guys, we are trying for the audio problem. Stay tuned. 5 minutes.
ऐसे बैंडविड्थ तो लोगों को बहुत कुछ रेशियो रहेगा तो चैट में डाल
Right.
चैट पे ध्यान
Yes.
हाँ एकदम आता तुमका फोन आ रहा मधनं कॉल पण झालाय
Hello. Is everyone able to hear my voice? Yeah, and sorry for the inconvenience. Suddenly the currents went off. That is why we had a break in between, or the internet wasn't working in between. So, and anybody, whoever faces an issue regarding the connectivity, please post it on the chat so that I can be able to view it. Because I don't understand whether the voices has gone or the video is gone if I'm delivering. So I can just see my slide deck. So that is why if you have any issues, just post it on the chats or somewhere. I'll be in touch. So previously, I'll just start over from the points that you have missed. Yeah. Is everyone able to hear me and see me right now?
Now
So
it
what
is
I was
fine.
saying,
Yes.
yeah. So what I was saying previously is in as per Ind AS 113, the fair value is the exit price. So we had various ways in which fair values could be computed. It could be how do you buy a new asset? It could be for how many years the asset would be used. There are various methods of computing a fair value. But the standard says that the fair value is the exit price. Is just you just remember this keyword that is exit price. After that, we would understand what is a market, what are the market participants, what is the asset and liability. So these are all concepts will be understood here and after ahead. But the key part is about the computation of fair value is remembering it is a exit price. Then further, what I was discussing is, or what I had previously discussed is, so that whoever has missed, they can recollect or they can come back to the points again. So further, what I was saying is in your valuation exams, you have MCQs, you have theoretical MCQs based on all these concepts. They ask what is a fair value. So they give options. It is the exit price. It's a new purchase of asset. Third option is it is of what you call replacement cost. There are various options which they give. Unless you remember this key terminologies, you won't be able to answer those questions. So for the persons who are giving the valuation exam, your main important 10 to 12 marks, I guess, are dependent upon this standard. So moving ahead to the next part, what is asset or a liability? So asset or a liability in accordance with Ind AS 113 can be standalone assets or liabilities, or it can be a group of assets or liabilities. Okay, so as per the standard, they have said that it can be, you can measure this fair value of a standalone asset, or whereas it can be as a group of asset. But why they have specified this? If you remember the impairment standard, in impairment standard, that is Ind AS 36, which is similar to the Indian GAAP, they have said that you have to mandatorily prepare a CGU, a cash generating unit. And CGU, they have given a method in which the CGU can be computed. So there is a concept of CGU. But whereas in this standard, that is Ind AS 113, there is a concept of you can either measure the fair value as per the standalone assets, or you can measure the fair value as per the group of the assets or liabilities. That is the main thing. Secondly, whenever do you compute the fair value, any kind of conditions attached to that asset which might change the fair value of the asset, any kind of restrictions attached to the asset, any kind of value, or because of the location of the asset the value might change. In such cases, those parameters also have to be kept in mind. So I'll give you a classic example. A particular entity XYZ holds or had received a land from a particular government entity. So government organization had given them a land on grant basis. Okay. But the condition attached to that land was this land has to be used for manufacture of oils and engines only. Other than manufacturing of oils and engines, this land cannot be used for any other purposes. Whichever buyer will use this land has to manufacture and sell oils and engines only. He has to be in the business of oils and engines. Now, this is a condition which is attached to the land. You cannot separate this land from this condition attached, because this is how the ownership of the land is driven. And it has been said that if any of this condition is not followed by the buyer, then the government has a right to take back this land. Now, when I'm measuring the fair value of this land, I have to consider this condition attached to the asset, because this condition is not separable from the asset. It is not specific to my buyer. It is not specific to that particular company only. Whoever is going to buy that asset has to follow for this condition, and the condition is only the business of oils and engines will be done on this asset, and no other business can be done. So this is how it will be covered. So this is about the condition and the location of the asset. So since these conditions are attached to the asset, or these are the peculiarities of that particular asset, that is why you have to take the cognizance of these peculiarities for the purpose of measuring the fair value. Second thing, if anything is there about the location of the asset. Now, even in Pune itself, if you have a flat in a Kothur location, or if you have a flat in Wagholi location, in that cases the fair value differs. Now, in such cases, you have to take in cognizance the location of the asset also, because you cannot separate the asset from its location. You cannot apply the fair value of Kothur property to the property located at Wagholi. So because of the location, because of the condition of the asset, because of any other restrictions attached to that asset, the fair value might differ, and you have to take the cognizance of such kind of restrictions, of such kind of locations, of such kind of conditions attached to that asset. Please remember this, because when you measure the fair value, you will get the difference. If I'm measuring a fair value of the land, in that cases, you have to take cognizance of where the land is located. Is it an agricultural land? Is it a non-agricultural land? Have the permissions for the purpose of converting from agriculture to non-agriculture, have they been carried in a smooth manner or not? If they're not carried in smooth manner, any point in time, government can raise a question on the activities conducted on the land. So these are the cases. So any particular characteristics of the asset which are specific to the asset have to be taken into cognizance when you decide the fair value of the asset. Let's go on to the second concept, which is what is a transaction and which is the most advantageous market. So moving ahead to the next part, which is what is a principal market or what is a most advantageous market. The standard Ind AS 113 says that a principal market is a market where the assets and liabilities are exchanged in an orderly transaction. Okay, the principal market is a market where there is a greatest volume or a greatest level of activity. So wherever the maximum level of activity takes place, that is a principal market. Now, in cases where the principal market is not available, in such cases you can go to the most advantageous market. What is the most advantageous market? Most advantageous market is a market where you get the maximum price for that particular asset, or there is a minimum price for that particular liability. So let's understand the difference with an example. Principal market is a market which has the greatest level of activities. So it means that, for example, if you have NSE and BSE, both this market have a orderly transactions which take place. Now, if you want to fair value a particular equity share, from where will you compute the fair value? From where will you compute the fair value in such cases? You have NSE also and you have BSE also. In such cases, what will you do is, you will compute what is the volume on each particular market for that particular share. If I'm measuring the fair value of say 5 equity shares. In such cases, if I'm measuring the fair value of 5 particular shares, in such cases, you have to see into, just a moment. Just a moment, we'll just resolve a technical issue. You can. हाँ पापा ये तो ऑन करो. Yeah. So Virag, can you be on the? Are you be able to see my screen? So I've shared the screen of. We are on to the two of three of the slides. Are you able to see my screen, Virag? Just a moment, participants. We are just resolving this. So Virag, which slide are you able to see? Are you able to see 2 of 3 slide?
No, only one introduction.
Okay, only one introduction.
First slide, I mean introduction slide.
Because I have shared, or I am into 2 of 3 slide.
I think you should, log out and log in again. That will be
Okay,
better.
fine. I'll just log out and log in again. बट ये वाला एक फिक्स स्लाइड वो ऑटोमेटिकली ले रहा है।
वो ना इंट्रोडक्शन का स्लाइड फिक्स ले रहा है ऑटोमेटिकली, वो क्यों ले रहा है वही समझ में नहीं आ रहा। ठीक है, पहले अभी तो ऑडियो फिर सर आपके यहाँ से ना श्वेता को प्रेजेंटर बनाओ ना, देयर इज नो प्रेजेंटर ऐसे आ रहा है। हाँ यस 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 ओके ओके चलो। नहीं पता नहीं कुछ इशू हो रहा है आज।
Are you able to see my screen of fair value considerations? 2 of 3. Yeah. So what we were discussing is what is a market. So for the purpose of market, we discussed the two concepts. That was a principal market, and thereafter we discussed the most advantageous market. So what are these two particular concepts? The standard says that if you have a principal market, you have to for sure go to the principal market. And what is a principal market is? A market in which the major volume or level of activity is carried for that particular asset or liability. To take an example for this concept or to understand this concept of principal market, the standard says that, or for example, I'll just give you example before. Now you have two markets, which is NSE and BSE. Now major level of activities are carried on both the markets. These two both are popular markets. Now what to do in such cases? Where the majority of the volume or level of activity is carried, that will be considered as the major, or that will be considered as the principal market. And in case if you have a principal market, you need not go into the second part, which is the most advantageous market. इसको देखने की भी जरूरत नहीं है इधर. So principal market, then what you will do for share by share basis. Now if I have 3-4 shares, I have shares of Infosys, I have shares of TCS, I have shares of some other 3-4 entities. I will identify for Infosys where the volume is higher, whether the volume is higher on the BSE or NSE. Then for the purpose of TCS, I'll see. Then for the purpose of the other as such, each and every equity shares, I'll see where the market is higher. Okay. So this is how you will decide the principal market. And in cases where the principal market is not available, you cannot identify where is higher level of volume. There is no comparable data itself. There is no such data available to identify or to compare market of each and every, or to compare volume of each and every market. In such cases, what to do? In such cases, you can see which is the most advantageous market. So the most advantageous market is the market in which you get a maximum amount for your asset and you get a least amount for the purpose of your liability. So this is the most advantageous market. Now the case might arise where suppose there is a principal market A and B. I'll take an example. So I'll just share my in that cases I'll just give you my example one more. I hope you can see my sheet. So for example, there is a market and there is a B market. Now in A and B market, the volume of B is higher. The volume of B is higher, but the price in market A is higher. What to do in that cases? Will you consider price as per B or will you consider price as per A? What will you do? In such cases, what you will do is, if you have a principal market where the volume is maximum, you won't see whether that price is advantageous or that price is not advantageous. So to take an example, for example, there is a commodity market. If there is a commodity market, I have a particular commodity to sell. There is a, for example, suppose there is an iron commodity or there is some other commodity. Now there are two markets. I have MCX, which is a wholesale market, and I also have a retail market available to me. Now, logically, majority of activities or the volume in the wholesale market is very high. The volume in the wholesale market is very high, but the volume in the retail market is low. But if you see the price in retail market is high, but the price in the wholesale market is very low. What to do in that case? In such cases, you will ignore the retail market because the standard says that first you have to identify where the volume is highest. Once you identify where the volume is highest and you are able to identify such things, you will see the price as per that market itself, and you won't see whether that price is advantageous or not. So this is about the principal market and the most advantageous market. Moving ahead to the next point. What is market participant and what is the price? We'll refer to that concept. Now, market participant is a participant who has the knowledge about the market. So market participants are the buyers and the sellers in the market, or in the most advantageous market. They should be independent. They are not the related parties of the entity. If you define the price as per the related parties, you will get an absurd value for that particular transaction. They are knowledgeable. They are also knowledgeable and they are having an understanding of the asset. They are having an understanding about what condition the asset is into, what difference will the asset's location make, what are the restrictions attached to that asset. So everything is, the buyers are knowledgeable about all such circumstances, and you're not making a sale to a a buyer who is not having a knowledge about the asset. If today I go and sell a technology to a person who has never seen that technology, if today I go and sell a particular software to a person who is not aware about what information technology is, how a particular software works, he has not ever used such kind of technology, will he be able to assign a proper price to that asset? Obviously, no. How will I understand what is the peculiarity? If today I go and sell some artificial intelligence to a person who has never, or to a market of buyers who are into the commodity trading, they everyday trade goods such as iron, steel, oil. Now, who are into this business or such market cannot assign a proper value to an asset where you're selling a technology called as artificial intelligence for a particular asset. So that buyer should be a knowledgeable buyer. That buyer should be able to transact in that asset, and the buyer is willing to transact in that asset. What does it mean? You have not forced a particular buyer to transact into that asset. The buyer is willingly transacting into that asset. So these all conditions should be satisfied to decide who are the market participants. If either of this condition is not satisfied, for example, if a market participant is a related party, in that cases, you will not consider that market participant as in your case for the purpose of valuation. To take an example, if I'm taking an example of, say, I want to value a particular land. Now, in the valuation of land, what I will see is, in my nearby area when I'm valuing that land, what kind of transactions have already taken place. If I've listed certain 3 to 5 transactions which have been already taken place. Now, when I'm listing such 3 to 5 transactions, I identify that there is one of the transaction which is just a transaction between the group companies. And in such transaction, which is a transaction between group companies, these two companies are related parties. So this price might influence the way in which I will value my land. So that transaction has to be ignored for the purpose of your fair valuation. Okay, so this is about the market participants. All the conditions should be satisfied to understand or to achieve the market participants. Now to move on to the second aspect is, what is the price? This we have discussed in our manner previously. So the price is nothing but the exit price of an asset, and it is not a transaction price. So what does the transaction price mean is, the transaction price is not a day-to-day transaction price in which you buy, again you can sell, again you can buy, again you can sell. It is not a trading of that asset. And the second part is, it is not an entry price. So nobody is gonna newly buy that particular asset. It's not a price of a new asset. Okay, so it is, remember, it is an exit price. Now, what exit price does not mean you're going to sell off that particular asset and the buyer is taking it as a scrap value. It is not scrap for that particular buyer. So always remember a point that exit price does not mean that asset will never be used. So exit price means, for example, if a life of a particular machinery is say 15 years, and I've already used that machinery for a particular 7 or to 8 years. Now, exit price is the price at which I can exit from that particular asset. The new buyer can buy that asset, and the new buyer is going to use that asset for the remaining useful life. So this is about the price that you will assign for that asset. Now remember, any kind of transaction cost will not be reduced from the fair valuation. So whatever, if today I have a property, today I have a plant and machinery which is located at my location, and I decide and I receive an exit price of say rupees 10 lakh. But to sell this plant and machinery, I had to give a commission to a commission agent, which amounts to 1% of the value of the transaction, or say 3%, whatever might be the percentage. So this 3% of the value of 10 lakhs, that is the 30,000, this 30,000 won't be reduced from the fair value of the asset already. So this is the case. This won't be reduced from the exit price decided, that is the fair value decided of that particular asset and liability. Now, but please understand, how did we decide which is the most advantageous market? In case of most advantageous market, you decided a market which gives a maximum value for that particular asset or liability. While determining the most advantageous market, you will deduct the transaction cost. Now you will say, let's give an example for this. So I'll just open a Excel sheet and I'll give you an example. So just a moment. I hope you can see my Excel sheet. Now, when I'm just mentioning it over here, there is market A and there is market B. Now, the selling price in market A is 1,000 rupees and the selling price in market B is 1,200 rupees. Now, as per these two markets, the most advantageous market is say B, because the price in market B is very much higher. However, the transaction cost in market A is hardly rupees 10, whereas the transaction cost in market B is rupees 300 because it is located in a very remote location. So to identify which is the most advantageous market, you will deduct the transaction cost. And after deducting the transaction cost, you identified, or it came into a knowledge that market A is the most advantageous market. So for the purpose of determining which is the most advantageous market, you will deduct the transaction cost. Once you deduct the transaction cost and decide which is the market, which is the most advantageous market, the fair value as per Ind AS 113 in such cases is the price which is without deducting the transaction cost. Now the fair value of that particular asset is rupees 1,000. I hope it is clear. For the purpose of deciding which is the most advantageous market, you will deduct the transaction cost, and after that, to decide what is the fair value, you will not adjust for the purpose of the transaction cost. So this is about the transaction cost. Now, in Ind AS 113, what they have said is, they have specified certain considerations for the purpose of non-financial assets. Now, non-financial assets means this will not be applicable to the assets which are fair valued in accordance with Ind AS 109, Ind AS 32 and Ind AS 107. So whichever assets you will classify as financial assets in accordance with the financial instrument standard, these considerations won't be applicable to such kind of assets. So what are such? This will be applicable only to non-financial assets. And non-financial assets means land, building, property, plant and equipment, plant and machinery, intangible assets, investment property. So such kind of assets are non-financial assets. Now what the standard is saying is, the asset or the buyer is gonna use the asset in a best form and best manner. If today I'm using a particular asset, say I'm using a building and I'm using it for my administrative purposes. Okay. If a particular other buyer is gonna set up his plant in that building, he might give a better value to that building because he's gonna put up his plant or whatever for that building. In such cases, it is assumed that the buyer is gonna make a best and highest possible use of that asset. So that is the thing is, So whatever is the best use of the, irrespective of the fact that I am not using that asset for that particular manner. So this is how the buyer will make the best and the highest possible use. Now, for example, if I have a land, take another example. I have a land. Today I have developed a garden on that land. Okay, there is an area of say 500 square feet, or there is an area of 1000 square feet. Now, on that 1000 area of a vacant land, I have developed a garden, and that is getting being used by the common people as a for the purpose of their general purpose. It is being getting used. Now, there is a buyer who is gonna construct a residential property on that area. Now tell me, just the fact that I am not using the land, or that land is not getting used for constructing a residential property and it is just used for the purpose of developing a garden, will you value that land as if the garden will be continued for 100 years? No. You will have to see that what is the best and highest possible use of that asset from a market participant's perspective. You cannot say that now if that land is located, to continue that example further, that land is located in a in a residential area. In such area, residential building itself will be the best and highest possible use. Now you would say, why not development or construction of a factory will be best and highest possible use? Because it is a residential area. The residential area or that particular members or the people in that particular area will never allow constructing a factory in that location. That is why the highest and best use is by constructing a residential property in that area, and not by continuing that land for the purpose of just creating a garden out of that land. So this is how you determine, and this is purely for the non-financial assets. Okay. Then when you decide which is the best and the highest possible use, you have to see whether it is physically possible in that area, whether it is legally permissible, and whether it is financially feasible. If particular activity is not legally permissible itself, irrespective of the fact that it is very much profitable to do that activity in such area, you will not consider it. For example, if a land is an agricultural land, you cannot decide or you cannot come up to a conclusion that constructing an industry on that land is the best possible use, because legally a agricultural land cannot be used for industrial purposes unless that agricultural land is converted into a non-agricultural land and be allowed for industrial purposes. You cannot consider that industrial constructing an industry on that land is the best possible use. So this is about the how to decide for what purposes the asset would be used. Just to assume that whatever the entity is using and however the entity is using that asset, the asset would be continued to be used in the same manner is not the assumption to be used for the purpose of deciding the fair value. Please understand the background. This standard has given principles attached for the purpose of fair valuation. Nobody can give you a strict guideline or a strict set of rules of how to decide the fair value. Any standard can provide a guidance about how to decide the fair value of a particular asset or a liability. Okay, so this is about how a particular or which kind of special considerations are given for a non-financial asset. Moving ahead to the next part, what are the valuation techniques? There are three methods of valuation given under this standard. Before that, let's understand what are the valuation techniques worldwide, or what are the commonly accepted world valuation techniques. So you know DCF, that is discounted cash flow method. You know what is a book value approach. So book value is nothing but purely assets and liabilities, whatever appearing in a books of accounts is a book value method. Then there is an adjusted book value method. Okay. Then there is a market value. So whatever is appearing in the market, that is your approach. Then third market will be a P multiple approach. So the price earnings multiple approach is one of the method. Then you will say multiple of EPS. So only the earnings multiple is used for the purpose of valuation. There are various methods which are commonly used for the purpose of valuation. But here the standard has given only three methods which are the accepted methods for the purpose of valuation. So which are these three methods? These three methods are the market approach, the income approach, and the cost approach. So what does this mean? Let's go one by one. The market approach means using the prices or other relevant information that is available in the market as a whole. It can be for that identical asset or for such comparable assets. So if there is a market available and if you have an identical asset price, then that can be considered as a market price, or it can be for a comparable assets or liabilities or a particular group of assets and liabilities. Now, to give an example, if I'm valuing shares of a listed company, it is very simple in such case. You will go to the market, you will identify what are the shares of the listed company, what is the fair value appearing on NSE or BSE. You will decide where the volume is higher. For example, if the volume is higher on NSE, then you will consider that market price as a price because you have used the market approach for the purpose of such valuation. Very simple. The market approach is very simple. Or it can be, for example, I'm valuing a particular share of a company. When I'm valuing the share of the company, that company is not listed. That company is not listed. So I'm finding out a comparable company, which is a listed company, and I'm using those parameters for the purpose of valuation. Now, please understand, in such cases, you cannot use the market price of a listed company as it is. You can just use the parameters of a particular listed company. Suppose a PE multiple of that industry. You can see what is the PE multiple of that industry, and you can just take it as a comparison purposes or for the purpose of comparable assets and liabilities. And you cannot take it as it is. It just can be one of the approach for the purpose of your fair valuation. Now, please understand one more fact. It is not necessary that you have to value the assets or liabilities only using one particular approach. You can value it considering two approaches, three approaches. You can assign weight to that particular approaches. This is always allowed. So I can always take particular market approach. I can take the considerations given in that market approach and use for the purpose of my valuation. This has been allowed by the standard. And one more basic fundamental remember is the highest importance is given to observable inputs. So what does observable inputs mean? Observable input means, suppose for example, a market input. So if a price is as per the listed company of a listed company, it is as per NSE or BSE, here it is very much assured. You have assurity on that price given. So the more the observable inputs in a particular valuation, the higher is the reliance placed on that valuation. The lesser are the observable inputs. What does it mean? There are more non-observable inputs in the valuation. The lesser is the reliability on that valuation. So you should just ensure there are more observable inputs in your valuation. And second approach. What is the second approach? Income approach. So what does income approach mean? Very simple. It is as good as a discounted cash flow method. So what do you do in discounted cash flow method? In discounted cash flow method, you discount the future values into a single current value, which is the market value for that particular, which is the fair value for that under that approach, under the income approach. So you list down the cash flows. You list down the cash flows, you discount that cash flows, and whatever is the present value of that cash flows, it is the fair value of the company. Now, when you are using the income approach, there are various things that you have to factor in. If there is any, you have to consider the factors for how much is the company liquidable. Is it easily liquidable? Is there two companies? One is a listed company and one is a non-listed company, and you have to value under the income approach. If exactly the business is same, all the financials are same, everything is same, assume for a time being. But just because this company is a listed company, the liquidation of this company is very much easy. Whereas the liquidation of this particular company is not easy. That thing you have to factor in. Then this information about this data can be reliably achieved. Whereas the information about the unlisted company cannot be reliably received. The buyers for this company cannot be reliably received. So this is about the income approach. Then additionally, what you have to factor in, when you will decide the discounting factor of the company, you will also factor in how much are the risks attached for that particular company. If the company is more riskier, you will use a increased discount rate. If the company is less risky, you will use a lesser, or you will use a lesser value of discount rate. Why so? You have to factor in your risk in your discount rate, and at that discount rate, you will discount the future cash flows. So this is about the market and the income approach. Moving ahead to the next part, which is the cost approach. Now, please remember or please understand, cost approach does not mean whatever was the cost or whatever was the historical cost of that asset or liability. No, never a particular standard. You refer to any valuation standard, you refer to generally accepted valuation techniques, you refer to any valuation techniques. Nobody would give an emphasis on the cost approach, which is their book value at cost or at historical cost. Nobody will give any reliance on that particular approach. It can be used just as a basis, but it will never be the best valuation technique. So what is the cost approach as per Ind AS 113? A valuation technique that refers the amount that would be recovered or the amount that will be required currently to replace the existing asset. So this approach is nothing but a replacement cost approach. In short, if I have this particular machinery, if this has to be replaced with the similar amount of, with a similar capacity of machinery, then what will be the amount required? Please understand the fact, if my machinery is 10-year-old, then I will also consider the replacement value of a machinery which is 10-year-old, or I will discount for the factor that this machinery is 10-year-old. So for example, if I have a current machinery, which at that point in time I had purchased at 10 lakh rupees, and then I depreciated it for the period of 10 years, then the value today is say 5 lakh rupees. Okay. Now I will see what if I go and replace this asset. If I go and buy a new asset, but new asset which should be 10-year-old. In that case, how much will be the value of that asset? That will be the value under the cost approach. Now, obviously, as I said earlier, you can use multiple methods. You can give one, if you have income approach as well as cost approach, you can say assign weight of 3 to income approach, and you can assign weight of 1 to the cost approach. And eventually your fair value will be weighted average of income approach and the cost approach. Okay. Now, the general principles that have been laid by the standard is, you have to keep in mind that you have the sufficient data for the purpose of fair valuation. If you don't have the sufficient data, then this fair value cannot be considered as a reliable technique. Second is, you should have the majority of observable inputs. You have to maximize the observable inputs and minimize the unobservable inputs. So, as I said it earlier, your unobservable input should be the minimum. Now, these are only the 3 methods allowed. So, in short, any method other than this 3 method will not be considered as a method or will not be considered as valuation in accordance with Ind AS 113. So, go back to the companies. If you have audited any kind of Ind AS companies, if you have been part of any kind of Ind AS companies, then please see which was the valuation technique used. What is the valuation technique that they have used? So, if they have used a valuation technique as a net book value approach, then that method was never allowed. That is not in accordance with 113. If they have used a cost method or a historical cost method, that is purely absurd results given, and which is not the approach allowed as per Ind AS 113. So, as an auditor, your responsibility is not just to receive a valuation report from a valuer. You will also have to understand which approach has been used by that valuer, whether that approach is in accordance with Ind AS 113 or not. And only if that approach is also in accordance with 113, only then you will accept that valuation in accordance with standard, and you will audit and you will certify that the valuation has been carried in accordance with Ind AS 113. I hope it is clear. I hope the approaches are clear. Whoever have already done the valuation courses, they would be well versed with what kind of approaches are there in totality and what kind of approaches are allowed by the standard. So this is there about the approaches allowed by the standard. Now let's move ahead. what is a fair value hierarchy. Now, fair value hierarchy. If you would have gone through any kind of annual reports of listed companies who are under Ind AS, you might have noticed that they always disclose level 1 disclosures under level 1, level 2, level 3, or valuation techniques or valuation hierarchy as level 1 hierarchy, level 2 hierarchy, level 3 hierarchy. What does it mean? Why do they mention level 1, level 2, level 3? And why do you have to classify each and every valuation under these levels? So let's understand this in accordance with what has been said under Ind AS 113. Now, moving ahead, if you have a quoted price which is unadjusted for any form, you had the identical item, that identical item had a quoted price, and you have used that price as it is. Okay, it might be from the principal market or it might be from the most advantageous market. In such cases, it is been said that the valuation is classified under level 1 because this is offer you have the most reliable value under this level 1. So in short, whatever you will see is if your particular asset is valued as per level 1, highest reliability can be placed in that asset because they have used a market price which is unadjusted for anything. It is just a quoted price of that particular asset, and that will be value assigned to that asset. So in short, if you have a share of a listed company or equity shares, in that cases that is a fair valuation which is under the level 1 criteria, level 1 category. Moving ahead, if you have adjusted the price, if you have adjusted a quoted price for certain other aspects, so these aspects are not a lot in nature. Now I'll give you an example. You have mutual funds. Now mutual funds is nothing but they take the quoted prices of the shares. They make a weight given to that shares. So if you have 10% of Infosys, you have 20% of some other company. They take the quoted value, they assign these weights, and then they derive onto the value. Then it deducts certain costs of the mutual funds, and then that is the NAV of that mutual funds. Now, is mutual funds purely a quoted unadjusted price? No, it is not a quoted unadjusted price, but this was a price adjusted. This was an adjusted price. However, whatever adjustments you have made were not significantly unobservable. So you have made adjustments, but these are not very much unobservable in nature. These are observable adjustments. Okay, then the valuation is under the level 2 valuation. Now level 2 valuation means it is of a second priority. So the first priority you give to the level 1 valuations and second priority you go to the level 2 valuations. Now in cases where these two are not there, so it is neither a quoted price, neither it was with the minimal adjustments to the quoted price, then it is a level 3 valuation. Now please understand level 3 is given a third priority. Now since level 1 is the most reliable method and level 3 is the least reliable method, or you give a less importance if it is under level 3. Why? Because the users can make any adjustments in accordance with him. You won't understand also what kind of adjustments were made. In such cases, highest amount of disclosures are required in accordance in case the valuation is under level 3, and the least disclosures are required if the valuation is under level 1 hierarchy. This is the hierarchy. You have to mention this level 1, level 2, level 3 hierarchy in your annual report also. In your significant accounting policies, you will have to mention what is level 1, what is level 2, what is level 3. What are falls under level 1, level 2, level 3. So if you have quoted shares, it will fall under level 1. If you have mutual funds, it will fall under level 2. If you have any other assets for which these two are not applicable, it will fall under level 3. Okay. After this session, please go and read a certain annual report of a listed company. Then you will understand all these concepts in a detailed manner. Further, we will also understand what are the disclosures required under the standard. Now, under this standard, on a primary basis, you will have to disclose in your significant accounting policies how is the valuation carried, What are the parameters used for the valuation and what are the levels of hierarchy used for the purpose of valuation? What additional is required? Whenever you carry a valuation for any particular asset which might be financial in nature or non-financial in nature, then in such cases you have to also mention what are the valuation techniques used, what were inputs given for that valuation. Okay, whether this is recurring or non-recurring measurement. So whatever are the inputs, in short, you have to give a brief about everything. How was the valuation carried? What are the inputs? Whether it is measurable or whether it is frequent, whether it is not frequent. Everything you will have to mention in your notes to the accounts. So always you will see a note called as fair value measurement in the financial statements of the entity. Then you'll also have to see that what is the impact or what is the effect in the statement of profit and loss and other comprehensive income. That also you'll mention in the notes to accounts. Now, to go ahead, you'll also have to see whether the what you call the whether there was any change between the hierarchies. Whether a particular asset you had measured previously in accordance with level 3, and now you have to move a particular asset from level 3 to level 2. Is such cases happened? Are such cases happened? If there are such cases happen, then you will also have to write it in your annual report that there are certain movement from level 3 to level 2. So let's take an example. So for example, I will download an annual report of a particular company. For example, KPIT Technologies Limited, I will download. It is a listed company. Everybody can see my screen, I hope. Whenever I show a disclosure for from any annual report, it becomes more clear. That is why I showed a disclosure from annual reports. Just a moment, just give me a moment. I'll take off 1780 because there was a merger that occurred in KPIT. Or I'll take off some other company. I'll take off Praj Industries Limited. Just a moment, everyone. I'm just downloading the report. So till then, we'll continue till the report is downloaded. Okay, fine. We'll continue ahead and then we'll discuss it. Okay, no problem. Let's move ahead. Okay, the report is downloaded. Now, I hope you can see my screen where I have opened the annual report of Praj Industries Limited. So let's go to the disclosures given by the company. Everybody can see the screen. This is rather significant. In the significant accounting policies, what do you give? I'll just show it. Where they might have given it in the notes to accounts. We'll just go to that note. I hope you can see the annual report that I've shared. And I'll go to the notes to the financial statements. Now over here, if you can see that there is a note of fair value measurement. I hope you can see the annual report. So wherever the fair value measurement is required as per the standard, they have classified in accordance with Ind AS 113. You can see over here financial assets leveled at level 2. So each and every fair valuation you have to level. You cannot skip a particular leveling of assets. Now whatever they have done, investment in shares, that is there over here. It might not be this thing. Investment in quoted perpetual bonds, investment in deposits, investment in NSE certificates. These all they are classified under level 2. Then they have classified it under level 1 certain kind of assets. They have classified the liabilities under level 2. So this is kind of classification given in accordance with this standard for this annual report company. This is how you disclose for each and every statement or for each and every caption you have to disclose the fair value in your annual report. And if there is any movement between two particular leveling, then you all have to disclose that also in your annual report. And this was about Ind AS 113, and I hope everybody has understood this standard and how to value under this standard. Then I hope the valuation people who are going to give the exam under valuation also have understood what to do. Now they have you have certain MCQs for your valuation, which have been given as an illustrative MCQs. That also you will understand after you have gone through this standard. I hope I have covered everything. You will able to understand or you will able to deliver for those MCQs also. Now let's go on to another standard, which is Ind AS 102, share-based payments. Now you would have also understood what is share-based. You under your Indian GAAP, you had a guidance note for the purpose of employee share-based payments. Okay, so if you issue certain ESOPs, that is, if you issue ESOPs to your employees, what to do, how to account for it, how to value those ESOPs, how to give the impact in P&L, was given in accordance with a guidance note in your Indian GAAP. There was no particular standard over it. Whereas under Ind AS, you have a standard on share-based payments. This does not only cover employee share-based payments, but this also covers all types of share-based payments. So what comes additionally in it? If there is a vendor, he has supplied me goods. In exchange of payment for the goods, instead what do I do is, I tell him I will give you an option or I will give you an option of my company. I will give you a payment in the form of shares. So that is a share-based payment. So it is not only specific to employee, but it is specific to any particular organization or any particular vendor or any one of the company to whom the payment is given in the form of shares of the company. Okay. So moving ahead to what is the guidance given under this standard. So there are certain definitions given. Now, a share-based payment arrangement, in such share-based payment arrangement, you can issue your own shares for the purpose of this payment, or you can give a cash or any other asset, and the value of such cash or asset is dependent upon these equity instruments. So for example, today I say to my employee, if you stay 3 years in my organization, I will issue my own shares. I will give you my own shares. This will be option available to you. And if my normal fair value of my shares is say rupees 100, instead I will issue those shares to you at rupees say 70. Now what is the motivation to the employee? If he stays for a period of 3 years in the organization, then he will get a share of the company at rupees 70 at a discounted value. So in those cases, what do I do is the employee is motivated and I'm giving him a consideration which are by way of issuing my own shares. Second way can be, instead of giving my own shares, I will give you a cash differential. So if my normal share price is say rupees 100, at that point of time, whatever would be my market price, I will give you difference in accordance with 70. So if my market price is 100 at that point in time, I will give you difference of rupees 30 into the number of shares. Or if the market price is 120, then I'll give you a 50 difference of 50 into the number of shares. So what is the mode of payment is? The mode of payment is by way of cash or by way of any other asset which is dependent upon the equity value of that company. So very much important is it should be dependent upon the value of equity instrument of that particular entity or any other entity within that group. What does it mean? If I am a subsidiary company, my subsidiary company is not listed. Now, since my subsidiary company is not listed, employees will never be motivated to have my own shares. But my holding company is Tata Motors, which is a listed company. Now, when I give the shares of Tata Motors as an option to my employees, the employees will be more motivated because they know the value of Tata Motors on day-to-day basis. It is a listed company. So even if I am issuing the shares or I am issuing the option to subscribe to my shares, even of my any other entity from the group, it is also a share-based payment, and even the accounting for such share-based payment will fall under this standard. Okay. Now moving to the types of share-based payment. As I discussed, it can be equity settled, it can be cash settled, or it can be both. You have an alternative. If you want equity shares, I would give you equity shares. If you don't want equity shares, you want cash, then I will give you cash in such cases. So these are the three options given by the standard. Then here in the third case, the cash alternative can be with the buyer, that is a subscriber to the shares, or it can be with the entity also. So if I have the option, in that case is how to account for it. If the employee has that option, in that case is how to account for it. Now in this, whenever I'm covering the standard, please note every time I'm using the word employee itself because it is more common in nature. You would find various companies who has this ESOPs. If it is a listed company, then ESOP would be the most common feature. If it is a company who is going into IPO, who is filing its DRHP, it is again a most common feature to issue the options or to issue the share options to its employees. Okay. So moving ahead to the another part. Then your accounting significantly depends upon whether it is a equity settled share-based payment or it is a cash settled share-based payment. Because in option 1, you're going to issue your own equity shares. Then option 2, you have to give the cash. You have to give the cash to the counterparty, to your employees, for example. Then accounting for each of this part is separate. Now, which is a third case where you have a cash alternative. If this alternative is with the counterparty, that means, for example, if employee has an option that he can either settle it in equity shares, he can either ask the company to issue the equity shares, or the second option is he can ask the company to settle it in cash. If that option is with the counterparty, then it is a compound financial instrument. We have discussed this word of compound financial statements previous day when we were discussing the financial instrument standard. So this is a compound financial instrument. And if that choice is available with the entity, if the issuer is having that choice, then in such cases, you will decide what is the company's intention. Is the company intending to give it in cash? If the company says yes, you will not just rely on what the company is saying. You will also see whether the company is having the financial ability to settle it in cash. Or what is gonna company do? Is the company gonna settle it in equity shares? So we'll decide what are these two cases, and accordingly, the accounting will depend upon each of these options. The accounting will change for each and every part. Please remember. Okay. So moving ahead to the next part. You might be remembering, whoever are there or whoever have studied the Indian GAAP, they would be knowing what is vesting condition and which is a non-vesting condition. Okay, so it depends. You have to take into cognizance what are the vesting conditions, and these vesting conditions, whether these conditions are achieved or they are not achieved, plays an important role in your valuation and plays an important role when you're debiting the expenditure in your statement of profit and loss. So vesting condition, for example, can be the employee is having, or if the employee will stay into the organization for a period of 3 years, only then this option will be available to the employee. Only then the employee will be having an option to subscribe to the shares of the company. So this is a vesting condition. It is as good as a conditional in nature. If you leave the organization before 3 years, the share-based payment or the employee stock option will not be available to that particular employee. So this is the case. Then what is a non-vesting condition? We'll discuss it in the next slide. So non-vesting condition would depend upon various market parameters. So this is not dependent. So whether the shares are issued to you or not issued to you will not be dependent upon these conditions. This is called as a non-vesting condition. So we'll just discuss it ahead in nature. Now, in some cases, it might be the vesting conditions would be performance oriented. It might be, for example, if you're issuing the shares or if you're issuing the share-based payment arrangement to your top management, you just can't say that if you stay in the organization for a period of 3 years, then I'll give you this share-based payment. You might have to factor in various other factors. So for example, you give a target. If the EPS is above this level, then these options will vest to you. If the EPS is not getting achieved above this level, then the options will not be available to you. So this might be one of the condition, or the another condition might be there should be 10% growth in revenue every year. This might be another condition. This is the performance oriented conditions, and it is just not about how many years the employee is staying into the organization. So this might be one of the performance condition. Another performance condition can be what will be the share price of the company, what will be the return given to the shareholder. These are various types of the conditions. They have classified the performance conditions into two parts. One is market performance condition and another is non-market performance conditions. So this market conditions is not only in the hands of the counterparty. Now market share price can change by any other parameters also. It is not purely in the hands of the employee to what extent the market price should vary. Okay. And the second might be the non-market condition. So what does it mean? The examples that I gave, the earning per share, how much is the turnover of the company on account of completion of any kind of project. So these are the non-market conditions. Okay. Now, why are these conditions relevant? Why are we discussing these conditions? So we'll understand in detail. Firstly, let's take an example. On 1st January, XYZ grants an option to an employee. Now, what has been said that the employee must remain into the organization for a period of 3 years before they can exercise this option. Now, whether it is a service condition or it is a performance condition, as I discussed earlier, this is a service condition. If it was said in this case that the employee has to achieve a earnings per share of minimum 10 in each year, only then the option will vest to that employee. In such cases, it is a performance condition. Now, it is upon the performance of the employee how the share-based payment is reaching to or how the option is getting vested to that particular employee. So, you have to divide whether it is a service condition or it is a performance condition. Moving ahead to the next part. That is, what are the non-vesting conditions? Now, non-vesting conditions are such kind of conditions which are neither in the hands of the counterparty nor in the hands of the company. So neither I can control it or nor the employee can control it. And these are the non-vesting conditions. If I mention that inflation rate should be above 5%, now in that case it is in none of the hands of the neither the counterparty nor the entity. These are the examples of the non-vesting conditions. Then again, one more example for this can be holding shares over a certain holding period, payment of monthly contributions. So these are again the conditions that counterparty can choose to meet. If it is neither in the hand of entity or nor the counterparty, or else it is only in the hands of the counterparty, then these conditions are said to be the non-vesting conditions. Because you cannot assess a particular employee or the option available to a particular employee cannot be dependent upon something which is not in the hands of that employee. If today I say that I will evaluate a performance based on what is the inflation rate, how is my concern or how is my performance dependent upon what will be the inflation rate? And why should my remuneration be dependent upon this thing? Now, one more thing, just as a background, why is this share-based payment so much popular in case of employees specifically? Because this is a mode of remunerating that employee. The more the value of my share-based payment, the more I'm remunerated. That is why should my remuneration be dependent upon a thing which is not in my hands? And that is why these are non-vesting conditions. Okay, so moving ahead to the next part. Impact of these conditions. What will be the impact? Now, please understand the background before understanding what is the impact of these conditions. To understand the background, any kind of options, whenever you have the share-based payment in accordance with Ind AS, you have to value that option. Now, this is an employee stock option plan. Okay, just to give it in a different language, the employee has an option to subscribe to the shares of the company. Okay. Now, suppose if today I issue this option to the employees that after 3 years you can subscribe to the shares of my company at ₹100, whatever might be the share price. In spite of that, you can subscribe to the shares of my company at ₹70, at ₹100. Sorry, I discussed it earlier. Now, if the share price is 200 at that point in time, I have a right to subscribe to the shares of the company by paying only ₹100. Now, if the share price of that company at that point in time is ₹80, still I have a right to subscribe to the shares at ₹100. Will I exercise that right or not is a different question. But still I have a right to subscribe to that shares. Okay, this is the case. Now, tell me, in such cases, what do you do for the purpose of accounting is you fair value this option. You fair value the option. Please note the difference. Fair valuation of shares and fair valuation of options is different. In accordance with the standard, in accordance with Ind AS 102, they have said that only the Black and Scholes model or any such popular model will be used for the purpose of the fair valuation. Okay. And whenever any particular standard gives a specific method of valuation, then Ind AS 113 is not applicable. Then you have to use that specific method given in accordance with that standard. Okay. Now please understand, you have to value that fair valuation, you have to value that option. Practically, even I have valued various options, and there is a huge difference between the valuation of the shares and valuation of these options. How will you value it? In a very simple terms, please understand, this valuation of these options depends upon how much is the share price of the company, how much is the volatility in that share price. Why do you have to see how much is the volatility in the share price? Because you have to assign a value to an option which is exercisable after a period of 3 years. If a share price is exercisable after 3 years, if a share is exercisable after 3 years, I have to estimate how much might the share price go after 3 years. Okay. Then I have to estimate how much dividend the company gives. Okay. Why is this important? Because as soon as you give the dividend, it has an impact on the share price of the company. So these are the factors that you use for the purpose of the valuation of the shares, valuation of the options. And then the second part is, how do you estimate the number of options? So I'll just note down in my Excel sheet so it is more clearer to you. So the first thing is, I hope you can see my Excel sheet. So please see the highlighted portion and whatever I'm writing the highlighted portion. First thing is valuation of options. Okay. And the second is how much are the number of options which should be used for the purpose of calculation. Now, why do you see how much are the number of options? For example, today I issue 10,000 shares. Today I issue 10,000 options, I would say. These options are issued to 4 employees. Okay, these are issue employee options to 4 employees. Each employee has 2,500 options. Okay, so what does this mean? What does this mean? That I have a right to subscribe to 2,500 shares of the company after a period of say 3 years. Okay, at ₹100. This is the arrangement. Now what do I estimate is how many employees out of these 4 employees will really stay in the organization for a period of 3 years. because this is a vesting condition. Now I'll see how many will stay. The condition is will stay for 3 years. Now I will estimate how many employees will stay in the organization for a period of 3 years. If I know out of these 4 employees, but there is one employee who might not stay for 4 years, who might not stay for 3 years, in that cases, I will never consider his option whenever I will decide or whenever I will compute how many options should be debited to the statement of profit and loss, or how much cost should be debited to the statement of profit and loss. Please understand, you will get confused. To decide how much options should be debited to my profit and loss, I will not consider if I estimate that one employee will leave the organization. Why did I do so? Now understand this slide, it will be easier. If there is a service oriented condition or if there is a non-market performance conditions, you have to factor these conditions in the number of options that will be vested to the employee. What does it mean? Let's go back to the slides where this was given. What are the service condition is? Service condition means what? How many years the employee will stay in the organization. If your arrangement, if your employee stock option plan contains a condition which is a service condition, where you will have to factor in this condition in determining the number of options. Then moving ahead, if there is a condition which is a non-market performance condition, means what? How much will the EPS go? How much will the revenue go? If you have such conditions, then also you have to factor in while determining the number of options that will be vested. Okay, so this I took it as an example. I'll take one more example. This is the second example. For example, I have given an option to employee A that if the EPS is above rupees 10, above INR 10, then I will give you 1000 options. If the EPS is above 15, I will give you 1500 options. And if the EPS is above 20, in such cases, I will give you 3000 options directly. Okay, so better the performance of the company, the higher the number of shares you have. Now, I as a company will estimate how much can EPS really go, or what is the expectation, how much an employee can really achieve. If today I estimate that only based on past trend, he will achieve only 15 as an EPS, then I will give that impact. I will only use 1500 options for the period of my amortization or for deciding how much expenditure should be debited to the statement of profit and loss. Clear? I hope it is clear. Or I'll give you another example. For example, like says that average EPS for a period of 3 years should be INR 10. So this is the average EPS. So whatever I've mentioned it over here, this is the average EPS for a period of say 3 years. Now if first year is already over, in the first year itself I understand that the average EPS or the first year the EPS is 10 only. It is not 15, it is not 20. So in short, I will give only 1000 options for the purpose of debiting into my statement of profit and loss. I hope it is clear to you all. Only these non-market performance conditions and the vesting conditions should be taken into cognizance while deciding the number of options that is to be vested. Now second, let's go back to our original slide. Any other parameters, that is the non-vesting conditions, for example, was the inflation rate, gold rate, and the market conditions, what will be the share price of the company. These all you should decide at the time of determining what is the fair value of that option. Okay, so this is to be considered at the time of deciding the fair value. And please note, you do not have to make the fair valuation as an auditor. There will be a valuer who will give the fair value, will give the valuation either under Black-Scholes model or there is a binary model for the purpose of valuation of the shares. And these models are very interesting and very good to do. We have ourselves valued various shares for the listed and unlisted companies. This valuation technique is a total different technique than what is given under Ind AS 113. So I hope it is clear to you all. And let's move on to the another part. How do you account for this share-based payments? Whenever you have an equity settled share-based payments, at that point of time, you will amortize the expenditure from the grant date to the vesting date. So over this period, you will amortize the expenditure. But how will you amortize the expenditure? You have to fair value the option as on the grant date. Whatever is the fair value decided at the grant date, you have to use the same value for the entire number of years. You will not keep on changing the fair value. In such cases, fair value is decided only once, that is as on the grant date. Once you decide the fair value, number of options can keep on changing at each year. So what does it mean? You have to do the cumulative adjustment to the number of options. What does this mean? If in year one, I expect that all the 4 employees will stay in my organization, okay? That is why while deciding the expenditure to be debited to my profit and loss, I take the number of options vested for all the 3 employees. But in year two, I realize that one employee has already left the organization and the second employee is thinking to leave the organization. In that cases, what will I do? I will do a cumulative catch-up. What does it mean? If only expenditure of 2 employees was debited from year one itself, how much would have been the total expenditure? That I will decide, and accordingly I'll debit the balance expenditure to year two. To take an example, I hope you understand it. For example, in year one, I decide these are 4 employees. Okay, these are 4 employees. Each employee has 1,000 options. Okay, and all these 1,000 options, the fair value of this option is ₹10. And I estimate that all 4 employees will stay for a period of 3 years and nobody will leave the organization. So here I will debit 40,000 is the total cost for the entire 3 years, and in year one I will debit only 13,300. But in year two, what happens is one employee is thinking to leave the organization. Then how many other options left? So your options left are 3 options into 1,000 into ₹10. Okay, so your expenditure should have been 30,000. Means what? Up to year two, how much should have been the expenditure debited to profit and loss? That should have been 20,000. Already I have debited 13,333, and that is why expenditure to be debited to statement of profit and loss in year two will only be 6,666. This is called as cumulative arrangement, which you will do in equity settled share-based payments. I hope it is clear. And please understand, even if there is an exercise date is after 1 year, after 2 years, the period up to the exercise date is not to be taken into cognizance, and only up to the vesting date has to be taken into cognizance for the purpose of deciding how much expenditure has to be debited to the statement of profit and loss. I hope it is clear, and I'm taking this quickly because this is same what was there under the Indian GAAP. Next is measurement principles that we have discussed. So equity settled share-based payment, how do you decide the fair value, and in this cases, how do you decide the fair value? The second thing what we need to discuss is, in case of cash settled share-based payment, it is a financial liability, and you have to fair value this financial liability at each reporting date, and the difference is transferred to the statement of profit and loss. What is the financial liability? We discussed day before yesterday while discussing the financial instrument. So in case of equity settled share-based payment, you decide fair value only once, that is on the grant date, whereas in case of a cash settled share-based payment, you decide the fair value at each reporting date. Okay, debit and credit we have discussed in while deciding now the accounting entry. Debit has to be given to employee benefit expenditure, which is you will debit the account called as share-based payment account, and the credit will be given to a reserve called as employee share-based payment reserve if it is a equity settled share-based payment. And if it is a if it is a financial liability, then in this case the credit will go to the financial liability, in which will be classified in the liabilities portion and which will not go in the equity portion. Calculating expected charge, this is how we discussed in this Excel example. You will decide the number of options. You will take the grant date fair value and you will decide how many number of shares are expected to be vested. And accordingly, you will decide the total value. Okay, you have to spread it over the vesting period and incrementally you will change the number of options. Okay, so this is what I discussed in this Excel example, and this is same as it was there under the Indian GAAP. This truing up also we discussed. This truing up is nothing but whatever is the change in the number of shares. In year 2, you decide as good as what would have been the expenditure for the period of 2 years. If only 30,000 options were vested, what would be the number? What would be the expenditure after a period of 2 years? And accordingly, only difference is charged to the statement of profit and loss, and balance in case balance is amortized for the next year. So in the third year, what would be the charge? In the third year, the charge would be 30,000. The charge would be 10,000. So how is your charge in these cases? In year 1, it is 13,003. Putting net, and the difference is transferred to the statement of profit and loss. Moving ahead to the next part. Just a moment. Moving ahead to the next part is this also we have discussed. This is a very interesting concept. Please understand it in detail. Group and recharge arrangements. Previously, what we discussed is there might be a case where I'm a subsidiary of Tata Motors, and in my case, I am giving an option to my employees that these shares of Tata Motors will be given to you. You have an option to subscribe to the shares of the Tata Motors. In that cases, what will be the accounting treatment? In such cases, in the books of the subsidiary company, what will be the accounting? Previously, if the shares were of the same company, what was the accounting? You debit the employee share payment account, which is the expenditure account, and you credit your equity or liability as the case may be. Whereas here, if these are shares of Tata Motors, and whether you're going to pay to the Tata Motors, if you're going to pay that proportion to your holding company, it is called as recharge arrangement. What does it mean? You're going to pay that proportion to the Tata Motors. If the value of the shares is say rupees 1 crore, a subsidiary company is going to pay that proportion to the Tata Motors equivalent to what was the value of shares issued by the Tata Motors. This is called a recharge arrangement. Recharge means the holding company is going to recover that cost from the subsidiary company. But what if there is no recharge arrangement? In that case, is what to do? Let's understand both the parts step by step. If there is a recharge arrangement in such cases, your accounting entry will be employee share-based payment account debit, which is expenditure account, to payable to Tata Motors. Okay. And Tata Motors will record the accounting entry as recoverable from my subsidiary company, recoverable from subsidiary XYZ, and credit to its equity. Equity will be employee share-based payment reserve. So this will be the accounting entry. And if there is a no recharge arrangement, in that case is what to do? If there is a no recharge arrangement, in such cases, the accounting entry will be expenditure account debit to expenditure account debit to additional investment by the subsidiary, additional investment by the holding company. I'll note it down over here. If there is no recharge arrangement, in such cases, the accounting entry will be employee share-based payment expenditure account to additional contribution from the holding company, or also called as securities premium. Why did we debit it? Because the subsidiary is issuing shares to the employees of the, or the holding company is issuing the shares for the employees of the subsidiary company. So in this case, the service is received by the subsidiary company, but the shares are given by the holding company. Why is the holding company issuing shares? It is as good as the holding company is making an additional contribution to the subsidiary company. So this is about what will be the case if there is a no recharge arrangement. And in the books of the holding company, what will be the accounting entry? Investment in subsidiary company account debit. Investment in subsidiary account debit to employee share-based payment reserve. So employee share-based payment reserve. Okay, the logic is same. Since you're not recovering anything from the subsidiary company, that is why we have debited this investment account. So I hope these things are clear to you. And this is how the group arrangements are recognized for. What are the disclosures under the standard? You have to disclose what is the expenditure debited, how much are the number of options outstanding, how much are the number of options granted, options forfeited, how much are the options exercisable at the end of the period. So these all disclosures you have to give. And please note that these are not generally made by the company who is auditing it. The person who is giving you the fair value of that option, that professional itself gives you this disclosure in this format, whatever is required in accordance with the accounting standard. This is given by that person. How you obtain an actual valuation report? In similar manner, you obtain this disclosure report from that valuer along with the valuation report. I hope this disclosure is also clear. I mean, you don't have to make each and every disclosure, but to give a brief about it, you have to give a reconciliation between what were the opening number of options outstanding, how many options are granted additionally during the year, how many options are forfeited during the year, how many are exercised during that period, whatever is expired. Expired means what? These options are expired and these are no longer outstanding at the end of the reporting period. Out of this, you have to show that how many are exercisable. So for example, the vesting conditions have already been carried and these options are exercisable at the end of reporting period because the employee has already met the vesting conditions. Okay, then you have to say that what is the average life of the option, that you have to disclose. What are the range of exercise prices, that also you have to disclose. What is the remaining contractual life, that also you have to disclose in your financial statements. So these are all the disclosures that you have to disclose in your financial statements. This is all about the share-based payment reserve. So I hope it is clear to you all and it is understood by you all. Further, to understand this concept, I mean to understand the differences between the standard, if you have to understand the disclosures, what are the detailed disclosures in accordance with standard, you can also refer any particular annual report of a company and decide how are the disclosures given. It will be more clearer to you. Any disclosure just by reading what is given under this standard is not very much clear. So this was all about the employee share-based payment, that is Ind AS 102. And then we'll also discuss the differences between other standards. So for the purpose of these differences, I have covered two important standards which we have not covered previously, and just these are for the purpose of differences only. So first standard we will cover is, just a moment. The first standard we will cover is the Ind AS 37. I have given references in other standard, but the important concept of Ind AS 37 is the discounting concept. So each and every provision which is generally a long term in nature, you will have to discount, and this discounting has to be done using the risk-free rate of return. So this discounting, so we have discussed decommissioning provision, restructuring provision, any other provision, each provision has to be discounted. Then in case of restructuring provisions, the standard says that you don't have to wait until there is a legal obligation. Even if there is a constructive obligation also, then also you have to provide for the restructuring provision. So don't wait until there is a legal announcement into the company. As soon as there is a constructive obligation, you have to provide for the restructuring provisions. The third difference is contingent assets. So in case of contingent assets, the standard says that if it is virtually certain that the asset will be recoverable, then you recognize the contingent assets. Okay. If it is probable that the contingent assets will be recoverable, in such cases you give a disclosure in your notes to the financial statements. This is a difference between Indian GAAP. In Indian GAAP, you do not disclose the contingent assets. You just give it in some director's report or something. This is about the provision standard. Then you have Ind AS 21. In case of Ind AS 21, what is the difference between Indian GAAP? You have a concept of functional currency in Ind AS 21. Okay, what is the concept of functional currency? For each entity, it might be holding company, subsidiary company, or any entity, to decide which is a functional currency. So what does functional currency mean is, it is currency of prominent or which is of the most importance to the entity, which is of the most prominence to the entity. the standard has given various conditions based on which you have to decide the functional currency. This is one concept which is new under the standard. Then there is a convenience translation concept given under the standard. What does it mean? For example, I have my entity called as Wipro. Okay, I give my financials in US also for the purpose of my disclosure. Now, whenever I need to convert my currency, whenever I need to convert my financial statements from INR to USD, I can use one common rate and directly convert all assets, liabilities, and profit and loss and disclose it in the US countries. Why? Because I'm just giving it for the US entities users to just understand what the financial statements are. And it is for none of the purpose. It is just a convenience translation. And the third is recognition of exchange differences. In accordance with Ind AS 21, none of the exchange differences are allowed to be capitalized in the cost of the asset. This is in difference with the AS 11, where there was a para called as para 46A, which allowed the differences in foreign currency to be capitalized in your property, plant, and equipment in your fixed assets. This is the difference between Ind AS 21 and your AS 11. I'm just covering this quickly because we have not covered this standard, but you should have an idea that what things are different compared to the old standard. And then there is the last standard where there is a different, completely different standard on agriculture. So in any of your company, if you have any biological assets, the biological assets means animals, plants, or if you have seeds. So if you have any your company where you have such biological assets, you have a completely new standard where the measurement requirements are given. So to give you a quick overview, in accordance with biological asset standard, the asset has to be fair valued at each reporting date. So you have to give the fair value of that asset. If you have trees, if you have animals, if you have, say, if it is a dairy industry who owns the cows and the buffaloes also, these cows are the biological assets for that company, and accordingly you have to fair value these biological assets at each reporting date. So I hope this is very much clear to you all and you have understood everything in detail. So if you have any kind of queries, you can anytime contact me. I'm just mentioning my contact number. So my mobile number is, you can WhatsApp me the queries if required, or you can email me. Any email is anytime preferable for you all. So this is all about the Ind AS. I hope you have enjoyed all the days, and it was very much good with whoever have attended all the 6 days. I hope you have gained the comfort over all the Ind ASs, and at least you can have a very much fair idea about what all the Ind ASs are. And with regard to the questions, I will reply to all of your questions by way of an email. I will download the questions of each and one of you, and I'll reply to you all by way of an email. Okay. And further regarding, I hope this will help you all to give any kind of review engagements or review any Ind AS clients, or if you want to implement Ind AS anywhere. If the Ind AS is applicable to your company, you can make the transition from the Indian GAAP to Ind AS. Please note, this is the biggest opportunity right now. There are very few CAs who are into this practice, and accordingly, this will help. This knowledge will help. Even if you don't have any such company, it will help you to understand the financial statements which are under this market, and you shouldn't be outdated with the new concept of Ind AS, and it will be helpful for you all. So I hope you have enjoyed, and we have a next series on GST. So let's close now. I'll hand over to Virag. Virag, are you there online? We have completed the session, and I'll reply to the queries over the email. So we can end up this session right now. Virag? So just a moment, I'll just contact Virag for the purpose of ending the session. So in case of you have any queries, I hope you have noted the mobile number and the email ID. It was good working with you all. It was good learning with you all. And I hope you have gained a lot of knowledge. And I hope this webinar was very much of importance to you all. The new session on GST is also starting. It is again a webinar series of complete 5 days on GST also. That will also, whoever have registered for that course, it will also be very much helpful to you all. So I guess he's busy somewhere. So have a nice time, guys. I hope you have enjoyed the sessions and happy learning to you all. Keep on updating your knowledge. Keep on updating your India's knowledge also. Keep on referring certain additional material on India's and on IFRS, and keep on updating on any new amendments on various standards. So it was very good talking to you all, and thank you so much. Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys. I'm ending this webinar right now, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Shweta.